Well, good afternoon. My name is Dyke Hendrickson, and I will be hosting a podcast each week known as Life Along the Merrimack. I will be talking with a guest each time, and they will be from the local area and have knowledge of our great resource, the Merrimack. We will be discussing the river, its history, its people, and its cities and towns. Also, we will examine concerns that the river water is getting dirtier, not cleaner, as we head toward boating and fishing season. This is a local show, and I am a local host. I am a journalist living here in Newburyport. I have written 2 books about the Merrimack, and for about 5 years, I was the waterfront reporter for the Newburyport Daily News. The Merrimack, of course, is one of the great resources on the North Shore. Most of us have great regard for this river, which happens to be about 120 miles long and goes deep into New Hampshire. This podcast will bring together historians, educators, scientists, authors, environmentalists, and public officials to discuss the past, the present, and the future of this great asset. My first guest is John Macone, a spokesman for the Merrimack River Watershed Council. John, some years ago, was editor of the Newburyport Daily News as well. So, John, one of my questions is, in recent news stories, and you've probably seen them as well, you've written an op-ed about it, as a matter of fact, it appears that the quality of the river is diminishing rather than improving. Can you talk about why folks are concerned that the river is getting dirtier?
Sure. Thank you, Dyke. It's an honor and pleasure to be here today. Thanks for inviting me. Yes, that's true. In particularly last year, the amount of sewage that's been going into the river has been going up and down over the years. It diminished somewhat when we had some dry seasons 3-4 years ago. Last year we saw a huge spike, more than doubled to over 760 million gallons that was dumped into the river. And that's a lot. I mean, that's as much as was going into the river around the year 2000. And since then, there's been improvements that have been made. But it gives you an idea of the problem that the Merrimack faces.
Well, my understanding is that sewage treatment plants along the river take in stormwater as well as the sewage from the community. Is that part of the problem, that the stormwater is mixing with the effluent coming from the community?
That's right. Yeah, that's how those systems are designed to work. Because when they were first put in, they were dumping sewage directly into the river with no treatment for the most part. And they realized that they weren't able to handle all of the runoff from storms that were going into the storm drains and the sewage. And so the systems were designed so that they'd be able to handle the sewage on a regular basis, on an average day when it's not raining. But when it rains a lot, they can't handle it, and so they're allowed to basically dump raw sewage into the river to prevent the sewage plants themselves from overflowing.
It seems like a lot of the municipal and state officials are aware of this. But talk a little about whether legislation is being framed right now, for instance, at the state level, which might provide some resources, at least to make people aware of when the dumping occurs, and also down the road maybe paying for some of improvements.
Sure, yeah. There's a lot of things going on right now. The past year, there's been a lot of awareness from people, a lot of outrage, particularly in Newburyport. This past year, people have told us all sorts of anecdotal stories that are interesting about dogs getting these terrible rashes and people getting sick when they're swimming or surfing or coming into contact with water. So the awareness has shot way up. And in response, our state legislators have been filing a flurry of bills. Right now, there's 6 bills that have been filed. Yep. So there's 3 of them that are related to what we call the notification issue, which is that when they dump the sewage into the river, there's no way for you and I, the general public, to know that that's happened. And the problem is that The biggest dumper in the river is in Manchester, New Hampshire. Lowell is the next biggest, and it takes days for that sewage to get down here. So it could be a nice sunny day when you're in the river, a couple days after the rainstorm, and that's when it's at its peak. So people really need to know that that's going on. So there are 3 bills that deal with that in different fashions. There's one bill that deals with a situation we had last year where the Greater Lawrence Sanitary District, which is a sewage plant that handles Lawrence and Andover, North Andover, Salem, New Hampshire, and Methuen, it lost its power, which was very unusual. And as a result, it had to dump its sewage into the river directly. And so this other bill is meant to have all of these plants have some sort of backup power on site and to prevent that from happening again. There are 2 other bills that have been filed, and they're to create commissions to basically study what's going on with the Merrimack and to recommend changes and improvements that can be made in the long term.
Well, needless to say, Newburyport is at the end of the line when it comes to sewage, and I remember when I covered City Hall 3 or 4 years ago, there was a big event upstream, and for a couple days, as you say, the river was brown, and the day would be sunny, and normally, you drive down to Plum Island, and with blue skies and the sunshine out, you see the blue water. But for a period of time, it appeared brown, and that was very upsetting. Are there, in terms of people who you're working with, are the mayors involved in this, or is it sewage treatment operators, or who is getting involved in this situation?
Sure. The most active mayors who are involved in it right now are Mayor Donna Holliday of Newburyport and Mayor Ken Gray of Amesbury, and I think a lot of that is because their communities have done the right thing. Newburyport and Amesbury and Salisbury, they don't dump any sewage into the river. They clean it before they release effluent. We don't draw water from the Merrimack down here, so treating it properly, but we're receiving all of the sewage that comes down. And we have such a huge boating community, and people are fishing, and they're some people are trying to clam, coming into contact with the water. So I think there's more emphasis at this end of the river than further up. But what we're trying to do with the Watershed Council is to spread the awareness up the river of how important it is to try to clean up the river and deal with this problem. And we're seeing that it's starting to catch hold. It is working its way up. Another issue for us is that you have 2 states.
And New Hampshire is a big player, but as I understand it, the rules are not quite as stringent, and they're a little slower to get on board in terms of what improvements can be made.
That's right. Different issue in New Hampshire. One of the sewage plants is really a model for the rest of them, and that's in Nashua. And the other one is the worst offender of all, which is in Manchester, just up the river. It dumps more sewage than any other plant.
Well, this is a little off the topic, but it's still much in my mind. Do you remember about 4 or 5 years ago when one of the treatment plants in New Hampshire, I think it may have been Hooksett, New Hampshire, they had these little circular objects that were supposed to go into the plant and hold back the effluent. Something went dastardly wrong, and we got thousands, if not tens of thousands down here. And actually nowadays, occasionally you could still find one. I assume that they're moving on with their technology.
That was a failed experiment. There were over 4 million that were released of those little things. And they've been tracked because they're a certain shape for each plant, so they're able to track where they end up. And they found them in France. So,
well, I don't think. What I remember is the folks in Hooksett were not very forthright initially because it was enormously embarrassing.
Yes.
It would portended to be enormously expensive, and so I can see why they might have been quiet. Right. Well, in the old days, one of the great successes of the 70s when Ed Muskie and George Mitchell, both senators from Maine, were able to move forward the Clean Water Act, and the Merrimack benefited, rivers in Maine benefited. Is there federal money out there that might be utilized to improve some of these plants?
Well, not enough. There is some, and that's another issue that we're looking at, is that all of these plants, there's 6 of them that are allowed to dump sewage into the Merrimack or into a tributary of it, the Nashua. But they're under federal regulations to clean that up over a period of time, like 20 or 30 years. So they each have their own plans in place, and they each have some federal money that comes to them, state money, but they need about, the estimates are like $800 to $1 billion, 800 million to $1 billion, for them to completely stop this. So that's a lot of money. Where is that going to come from?
Yeah, it certainly is. And in terms of climate change and more rain, or you alluded to it a moment ago, but is it the sense of some scientists that we're getting more rain over short periods? I mean, is that adding to the duress of the plants?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a climate change issue that NOAA has deemed for the Northeast, is that what we're going to see in the future is we're going to have much more intense rainstorms over a shorter period of time. So they're going to be almost like tropical downpours, and that's really the worst thing for these plants, because they get such a huge amount of water that comes into the sewage pipes in a short amount of time. They can't process it, and so they have to dump it. We had a day like that this past year. It was September 18th, and by our calculations, somewhere around 120 to 150 million gallons of sewage was dumped in a single day. Mm-hmm. That's a lot, but that, just to give you an idea how far we've come, we have a study I found from 1968, which was sort of the baseline study of what was going on in the Merrimack. And that's how much they were dumping into the Merrimack at that time every day. 120 million gallons of sewage.
Well, in 2016, I believe the Merrimack River was one of the 10 dirtiest in the country.
Right.
And even going back farther, several generations, when the mills in Lowell and Lawrence were working textile mills. At one time, in the mid-19th century, Lowell was the largest textile producer in the country, and a lot of that went into the river.
Right.
So I'd like to think the Merrimack is a resilient body of water, but I guess what I'm saying, it has a history of this, and can we get a hold of it? And because, as you mentioned before, this has become Newburyport has many vessels for tourism, many fishermen. There are 1,500 pleasure boats tied up on just the Newburyport side, and Amesbury and Salisbury has about 500. So you have more than 2,000 boaters, and then you have Casham Park, who become part of this community, and it would be nice if things don't get worse. Are you optimistic about this upcoming season?
Well, I'm optimistic that we'll probably get this notification bill passed. And that would be great. Then people will know when the dumping is happening. As far as the actual sewage going into the river, I don't think we're going to see any changes in that for years, because it takes so much money and so much engineering to do it. But there are solutions out there that some of these communities are working on. One of them I mentioned earlier was Nashua. And what they've done in Nashua is they've created this underground storage area for these overflows of sewage. It's millions of gallons in size. And so when they have what we call a CSO, a combined sewage overflow, the excess sewage goes into this, and it stays in there until it dries out and the sun comes out, and then they start to pump that through their plant. Doesn't go into the river. So that's a great solution. Yeah. And Nashua saw its overflow decrease from around 50 million one year to 5 or 10.
Wow.
So it was a big, it really made a difference. And that's just one of the things that communities can do, but you need a lot of space for it on the river that's close to your piping systems in order to do it, and that's not always available.
Well, in terms of space, I understand that one challenge in the future is the loss of woodland and farms up, north of Lowell, for instance.
Yep.
There's a lot of development going on along the rivers. They take down trees, they put pavement in. And this has been happening for many years, of course. But how are we looking north of north in New Hampshire? With the duress that the building boom is doing up there.
Yeah, that's you mentioned earlier that the Merrimack is one of the 10 most endangered, threatened rivers, and that's the primary reason. Is that about 2/3 of the entire watershed of the Merrimack is in New Hampshire. So it gets a tremendous amount of its water from New Hampshire, and New Hampshire is seeing a lot of development. Massachusetts, most of that watershed is pretty well developed now, so you're not going to see a lot. But New Hampshire is the area that needs to be watched, and that the development needs to be done in a way that minimizes the amount of overflow that goes into the river and into the sewage, into the drainage systems.
Years ago, and again, I'm going back to the mill days in mid-19th century, because it's a great interest of mine. I wrote 2 books about the mill industry and the French Canadians that came down to this area. But a lot of people used to talk about the great fishing that existed before the mills. I think more has been done, particularly north of the mills in Lowell and the New Hampshire cities. But maybe you can talk about fishing upstream and then a little downstream. I know that you're a fisherman yourself, and I've seen a couple of your videos, and they're harrowing when these large fish come out of the water. But let's talk about, how is the fishing these days, and is the fishing being affected?
Sure, yeah. Well, it's interesting. Henry David Thoreau wrote a book, A Week on the Merrimack and Concord Rivers. It's you want to get a perspective on where we've been. He talks about seeing some pollution in the river back then, and this is in 1839. So there's mills going on then. He also is lamenting the loss of fishing back then, and that's because of the dams that were going in. Used to be a huge salmon run on the Merrimack, and by the time Thoreau was paddling on it, that flow was already gone. But there are other fish that have, they put in fish ladders since then, and they've tried to encourage fish to make a comeback. The salmon never have. There was a big effort on that. That's been a failure. But there are the kinds of fish that are available in large numbers. One of them is Atlantic shad, and that's a pretty strong fishery in the river. People catch striped bass as far up as the dam in Lawrence, and we've seen a healthy comeback in those kinds of fish.
Well, how about downriver now? There are many times in the warm weather you see boats out there, and they seem to be getting stripers.
Yeah.
Now, one of the success stories that I'm quite pleased with is about 2 decades ago, it must have been, they decided to create a greater length on striped bass for what you could take. In the old days, you took schoolies that were 14 to 18 inches. Now they have to be 29 or 30 inches, I believe, and there's a limit. But maybe you can talk about, there are stripers there, and there are a lot of fishermen still out there. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there are a lot of striped bass right now that come into the river in the spring. Around Mother's Day, that's kind of the date that people look forward to if they striper fish. And we're seeing a lot of what we call schoolies, too, which are the fish that are, let's say, 20 inches or less. Thousands and thousands of them coming into the mouth of the Merrimack and working their way up. It's usually the larger fish that are going all the way up to Lawrence. But there's been a real change of late, I've noticed, offshore, too. There's a lot of herring off of Newburyport now. That's why we saw those whales that were coming in so close to the shore.
Close to your boat.
They're close to my boat, yeah. They are a little scary when they come up close.
I know. And another thing, when we're talking history of fishing, the sturgeon was once a relevant fish here, wasn't it?
Yes.
I mean, when you read the old literature, sturgeon is mentioned frequently.
Sturgeon was another major fishery in the Merrimack up through up until they put the dams in, really. There's still sturgeon in the river. I hear people catching them, but they're, I believe they're an endangered species too. So,
well, they're endangered in our area. That's for
right.
sure.
Yeah.
In terms of, one question that I'm asked frequently, perhaps by newcomers, about boating in the Merrimack, is the challenges of the entrance to the Merrimack River. We know there's a tide from the Atlantic. We know there's a strong current from the Merrimack. But still, you're a boater. What makes it so difficult to navigate the mouth of the Merrimack?
Well, the Merrimack has a very strong flow. When you look at the kind of the fluid dynamics of it, it's a river that starts out pretty high in New Hampshire and it drops relatively quickly. So by the time it gets here, that's why they had all the mills along it. It's so much power to it. That you've got a very strong flow that's going out. And when they built those jetties, if you look at them, they're shaped like a funnel, and they're meant to scour that what's called a bar offshore. It's meant to blow it apart. That was the original plan. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work. So what you have is this big sandbar right at the mouth of a funnel, and if the tide is going out, and the wind is going in a certain direction, you get these enormous waves that are created right there. It's very dangerous to get out at certain tides, usually on an outgoing tide. On an incoming tide, it can be very calm, and you think you're on a mill pond or something. So it's a very scary river.
Well, when I was a reporter, I went out numerous times because someone, usually at low tide, as you point out, someone had, come up onto the bar and hadn't been aware of it, or perhaps the bar had moved. Mm-hmm. Now, is that a possibility also that, the bar can move from year to year and it's not exactly where it was the previous year?
Yeah, I think so. I think it does move. There's a lot of sand out there that moves around all over the place. And, even within the course of a summer, you find that it's... you'll find sandbars or deep spots that have suddenly appeared that weren't there, a month earlier.
It's in terms of fishing. It seems like the tuna are doing pretty well. I mean, if you stand at the end in Newburyport on the docks, frequently you'll see big tuna coming in, and by big, 400, 600, 800 pounds. Yeah. And as you know, they're frequently, they'll get on the phone, the captain will get on the phone and he'll call up some auction houses, some of them in Japan, and say, look, we've got a 600-pounder. It looks very supple, very healthy. So it seems like the tuna, which has been around for many years, it seems like they're doing reasonably well.
I think so, off the coast here. In fact, if you go out to Plum Island, walk along the beach in the later part of the summer, you're probably going to see a tuna jumping out of the water. It could even be a half mile out, but they're so big and they jump completely out of the water that you can't miss it. I mean, it's really quite a scene. But again, I think that goes back to this issue with the herring. There's so many schools of fish that are off our shore now that weren't there a few years ago, that it's attracting all kinds of marine life to this area. It's exciting to see it, actually, to see that there's so much going on out there, because every time you go out, you never know what you're going to see. One thing, if I could add, a point about this is last summer I encountered a fish I'd never seen out there. They're called bonitos, and they are not native to this area. They're not supposed to be north of around Long Island. But that gives you an idea how much the ocean is warming, that it's now warm enough off our water to equal what historically had been the water temperatures, 100 or more miles south.
Sure. Well, that's a good news and bad news situation for the lobster industry. Yeah. Because I understand in Rhode Island, Connecticut, the lobsters are actually trekking north. They're looking for colder water. Massachusetts is doing okay, but Maine has had a couple bumper years, in part because the lobsters keep moving north. And it must be discouraging if you're in those parts of New England that they're leaving. But Maine has had a couple good years. Are lobsters pretty durable for what you've been able to tell over the years?
I I've heard that they are. There's a disease that was infecting them to the south of here, and it was slowly creeping up, and it damages their carapaces, and it's, visually people wouldn't want to buy them if you saw what they look like when they get this disease. So it's really taken a whack out of the lobster market to the south. And the worry is if this disease keeps spreading further north, that it'll hit our area eventually and then into Maine. But we'll see.
Another annoyance in our area, I won't go into it because I'm a very positive person, but the green crab has been troublesome. And this is a crab you can't really eat, although people are trying to.
Yeah.
But it's, it takes away some of the wildlife along the marshes. Are you aware of the green crab?
Oh, yeah, sure. I thought you had a recipe for green crab you were going to share.
Actually, excuse me, they're doing it overseas.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's been served too much here.
Yeah.
But, in the summer, of course, Plum Island is such a wonderful spot. When we're going back to the pollution and how we hope it can improve, have beaches been closed in the past couple years because of counts of bacteria, or have we avoided that thus far?
No, we haven't. Not around the Merrimack. It's been, let me think, it was 3 or 4 years ago that we had a beach closure. It might have been longer ago than that. But that's another issue, is that Newburyport monitors water quality with an eye towards the beaches, and the state does some monitoring as well. But it's really a hodgepodge of groups that are monitoring what's going on in the river, and that's another issue we'd like to see get tied up, that this becomes much more organized, and perhaps even the public could go somewhere online and take a look at what's going on and judge for themselves whether that stretch of the Merrimack that they're in is healthy at that particular time, because it changes. It could be a few hundred yards apart from an area. You could have a different environment in the river. It's so dynamic.
I'm speaking with John Macone, who is a spokesman for the Merrimack River Watershed Council, a group that's doing a lot to monitor the river and also work with local officials to make suggestions. And I wanted to ask, John, do you have events coming up or discussions that people could learn a little more about this situation?
Sure, yeah. We have an event that we're going to be hosting with the Essex County Greenbelt Association. It's going to be in Haverhill on March 14th, and it's going to be about the evolution of the Merrimack River from basically from the ice ages and before to today, and it's going to last about 15 hours.
Yeah, I was about to say, if you start the Ice Age, it's going to be a long moment.
We're gonna skip through a lot of things, but what we're going to do is we're going to give people an overview of some interesting facts about the Merrimack, and give you some perspective on this issue of pollution and how bad it got, and where we are now, where we need to go.
And when is that going to be?
That's going to be on March 14th. That's at the Haverhill Community Access Studio, and I believe it's at 7 o'clock at night. We also have our annual meeting coming up, and that's going to be on March 7th, and it's going to be at the Stark Brewing Company in Manchester, New Hampshire, and that's an event that the public can come to. One of the things that we're doing at that's going to be, I think, of interest to people in this area is there's a new film that's coming out.
I thought you were going to say a new beer.
Yeah, there's always that happening.
Well, we're near Newburyport Brewing, and so they're frequently coming up with new beers. Yeah. But excuse me, I got off the subject. Can you continue?
It has nothing to do with beer, but it is at a brewery. There's a very accomplished gentleman, a filmmaker out of New Hampshire, who's producing a film about the Merrimack, and it's what I've seen of it. It's really stunning. I think people will really enjoy it. He's planning to release it later this year, but he has clips from it, and he's going to present that, and he's going to talk about the film.
Well, that sounds great, and that's March 7th in Manchester, New Hampshire.
Right, yeah. I imagine when the film comes out, it's going to be shown around here a fair amount. I think there'll be a lot of interest in it. And
in terms of this year, do you have other elements that you're going to be having, or will you be trying to get more members when you have the March 7th annual meeting?
Yeah, we do. We try to encourage membership. We are a membership organization, so membership is something that we need to survive. And we're going to have events in the summer. We'll have more walking tours and some more lectures. We also do some river kayaking and cleanup programs on the river. I'm sure we'll come up with some other ideas, too.
Now, we're a Class B river, are we not? And to my knowledge, that enables not swimming, perhaps, but certainly boating and fishing under guidelines of catching the appropriate fish. We are still Class B, aren't we?
Yeah.
Well, one of my great things about the river, I'm a historian, an amateur one, but albeit an enthusiastic one. Yeah. So we talked about how vital Lawrence and Lowell were to the textile industry, but I wanted to go back a little further. This isn't exactly what we were talking about, but Newburyport, of course, was once actually the leading shipbuilder in New England. And I was at the Federal Parks Museum in Lowell this week, and Samuel Eliot Morison, who is one of the eminent historians from the 20th century, had a wonderful remark in his book, which I wanted to just read across so that people would be aware of it, because sometimes we don't know exactly what we have on the Merrimack River. The Coast Guard, for instance, has its birthplace in Newburyport, first out of Plum Island, and now it's on Water Street. But not everybody knows that. And here's a statistic that I find remarkable, and it comes again from an eminent historian who wrote years ago, "The lower Merrimack from Haverhill to Newburyport was undoubtedly the greatest shipbuilding center of New England in this period of 1793 to 1815. A study showed that shipbuilding on the Merrimack produced 1,115 vessels during that period of time." Wow. Isn't that amazing? 1,100. They were lined up from Newburyport all the way up to Haverhill. And so I guess I bring it out. A, it's remarkable, but B, one thing the program is going to try to do is bring some facts and some verities to the fore that not everybody knows. I've been lucky to be able to do this. I'm the outreach historian for the Maritime Museum down in Newburyport. So one of the things that I'm assigned to do is, bring out history and also bring out important information that you said today. So I think we're heading towards the gate as far as this show goes. This is our first one. We hope to be on weekly from now on, sometimes with people who know the river well, like John Macone, an Amesbury resident who was editor of the Daily News for quite a long time. Other times we may have authors. There's a woman who wrote a book about Coast Guard rescues that we're going to have on soon. And there are a lot of things that we can go into. But I wanted to ask you, John, before we leave, is there anything else you would mention about what we talked about? Or you have mentioned two things coming up, which is good. Anything else you would mention in terms of what people might do or how to monitor this situation?
Sure,
It seems like it affects all of us.
Well, I'll tell you what, the local papers have been great about covering these issues when we were talking about the notification and the CSO problems. So there are going to be all these bills that I mentioned that are going to come up before the legislature. It's a big help if people call their state reps or their senators and say, or email them, or go on social media, or write letters to the editor of the paper, say, I support this, and here's why, and maybe give an anecdotal story if you have one about how it affects you, because those sorts of things really matter in the end.
Well, you had a story, an anecdote about some fellow was taking his dogs and running them into the river. And, I think you mentioned that, that might not be a good idea for the health of the dog. And, Newburyport, Amesbury, a lot of these communities have many, many dogs. So as spring comes up, that's probably
that's
a good
true,
thing
too.
to
Yeah,
know
the
as
dogs are another issue. Yeah, a lot of people let their dogs swim in the river, not realizing that. Yeah, and of course, dogs are drinking the water, too. So
yeah. So I think we learned a lot today from John Macone. We will be on again in the future. And this is Dyke Hendrickson. I'm the outreach historian for the Maritime Museum here in Newburyport. We're going to bring more information, more history, more awareness of the Merrimack River. So thank you very much for being part of this, and we're going to move along till the next time. Thank you.